Deputies McGrath, Collins, Healy-Rae and O'Donoghue for the proposed motion in relation to the protection of cash in the financial system, and to all deputies for their contributions to the discussion this morning. As Minister Smith outlined, this is an important issue and priority for the Government, and we're not opposing this motion. It is so aligned with what Government is trying to do, albeit at a slightly different timetable, and I'll outline that, and I'll also try and address as many of the different issues that have been raised as I can to provide more information. I forgot to wish deputies a happy International Women's Day, but I was so glad to hear so many deputies, Deputy Collins, Deputy Pringle, Deputy Munster, raise the importance of cash as part of a response to domestic violence and coercive control, and that really it's cash in vulnerable situations, cash to people in vulnerable situations, is a core part of why we need to make sure that we provide access to cash all of the time. As the motion put forward by the deputies is entirely consistent with the findings of the Retail Banking Review published last year, and that review recognised that Government and the Central Bank, in line with the ECB's cash strategy, have a fundamental responsibility, together with the banking sector, to ensure a smooth supply of cash and facilitate the use of cash payments by consumers and by SMEs. At present, as deputies have talked about the legality or illegality of refusing cash acceptance, it's not illegal to refuse cash acceptance at the moment once it's been displayed clearly to the customer. But that's not enough. That's not what we're talking about. It's not ideal, and it poses real risks to sectors of society, and that's what I know deputies here are trying to highlight today. So that is going to be part of the National Payment Strategy, which will be done and completed in 2024, which is also recommended by the Retail Banking Strategy. And I think Deputy, and forgive me, I just don't remember which deputy raised the particular question about An Post. It may have been Deputy Nolan, forgive me. Officials are working on access to cash legislation. As we said, I think Deputy Shortall looked for a timeline on that, and I think we will have heads in the second half of 2023 with a view to enactment in 2024. But as part of that legislation, there is a question around An Post around determining what is access to cash exactly. Is it access to cash through post office? Is it access to cash through banks? Is it cash back in shops? The role of An Post is not being ignored, is what I'm saying to you, and it's part of the conversations that I would be have had with An Post already, in the context of looking at where different communities have been left too short, frankly, without trying to make a pun, by the removal of the retail banks in different communities. I would maybe push back Deputy Nolan on the point about government deputies responding to the potential withdrawal of cash services around the country. I recall my colleague Deputy Griffin from Kerry saying that AIB had shown despicable disregard for people in his community and for customers more broadly. Indeed, I was on the radio giving out very strongly about it from an access to cash perspective, and I think that was very broadly felt right across this House, and it is one of the very many reasons that we're completely agreed on the need to provide ongoing access to cash. So it's access to cash through legislation from the Retail Banking Review. It's also the acceptance of cash, which is what so many deputies have highlighted here in relation to, for example, the GAA and others. And the GAA issue, many deputies have highlighted that, and okay, that is a matter of contract law, it is a matter for Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, but if I could say to you, that is exactly the sort of issue that we need to consider in the National Payments Strategy, about cash acceptance and where cash is acceptance. And what that will do is it will examine the potential requirement for certain firms, for certain sectors or subsectors, government, public bodies and others to accept cash, and that would include, as deputies have correctly highlighted, the likes of the National Driver's Licence Service. So do we have to require that everybody accepts cash? Do we have to require that every coffee shop accepts cash? I don't know. We need to talk that through, but I certainly am of the view that, for example, every supermarket or everywhere needs to accept cash, and that there's no discretion in relation to that. So I think we need to think through the different parts of our society to work out what's absolutely fundamental in terms of accepting cash, and where can we exercise more discretion, and how do we think about that going into the future. If I could say, I want to try and address everybody's points insofar as I can. The plan for the retail strategy. So the motion calls on government to instruct all Irish banks and banks that operate within the jurisdiction to provide reasonable access to cash, allowing for the further evolution of the cash infrastructure to be managed in a fair, orderly, transparent and equitable manner for all stakeholders, and to ensure all retail outlets and businesses, together with consumers, have access to cash services. The motion also calls on the government to categorically state and instruct via the CBI and Minister for Finance that all retail banks preserve consumers and businesses access to cash services pending the development of the access to cash legislation. The trouble is we don't have the powers to do that under the current legislative basis, and I think, though, what we're signalling very clearly is that that is where we're going with legislation, and we are doing that this year. So I think if deputies would allow us some forbearance on that, this is part of the government strategy. This is the department officials in the Department of Finance and other departments have beginning work on this at present, and the sector is well on notice that this is where the legislative intent and this is where the framework, this is where we're going, and that any reduction in cash services between now and then would have to be rectified when the legislation is enacted. So I think we have signalled very clearly exactly where we're going. I do want to also respond to Deputy Doherty mentioned a number of different issues in relation to cyber threat, security measures, privacy, and I think it's important to highlight the EU Payment Services Directive, which originally came out in 2018. That EU legislation focuses more on the card and digital elements, and our officials in the Department of Finance are actively involved in discussions at EU level to ensure that consumers are protected when making electronic payments, and that will review fraud rates, security measures, information requirements for customers, costs and fees. So I thank Deputy Doherty for raising that. But I also want to make another point about cash that I had to reflect on in listening to the contribution of Deputy Doherty and indeed other Sinn Féin TDs. It was very good to hear Sinn Féin contribution to the Dáil motion on access to and use of cash, and especially good to hear Mr Doherty, Deputy Doherty, Sinn Féin spokesperson on money and finance and Sinn Féin party treasurer, on his perspectives on access to and use of cash, because of considering he managed to amass €180,000 in cash to pay for a constituency office, a feat that I could certainly never manage in terms of cash. But also recognise the businesses left high and dry by Sinn Féin, who would, I imagine, love to have been paid in cash, if paid at all. The €600 left to the RIA during the 2016 election, the €5,305 left to a postering company in 2014. Would have loved to have been paid in cash, if paid at all. But of course it can be hard to keep track of cash, in fairness, which might of course be the reason for the very sparse Sinn Féin electoral returns, their statutory electoral returns. Too much cash or too little cash, it sort of depends on where you're sitting. But of course cash can pose risks, and less cash does have important security benefits, as it reduces the risk of security raids, such as the one on Northern Bank in 2004. So the role of cash in society is an evolving concept, an evolving risk, an evolving threat, depending on where you're sitting. But there's simply no question that access to cash and use of cash is a pertinent matter for everybody in Irish society.